Welcome to the Thomistic Institute podcast. Our mission is to promote the Catholic intellectual tradition in the university, the church, and the wider public square. The lectures on this podcast are organized by university students at Thomistic Institute chapters around the world. To learn more and to attend these events, visit us at thomisticinstitute.org.
Thanks so much, Peter, for that generous introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. Two of my favorite institutions in the higher education world today are the Thomistic Institute and the Alma Institute and its sister institutions. So I'm delighted that they're working together and happy to be here. And I'm going to be talking about The Religious Life, the book that I published, which I gather there's some copies up here that for free later. Is that right, yes. Peter? Okay. So if you get up here fast enough, then you get a free copy of the book after the talk. But don't come up now because I'm talking. Okay. So the religious life, as I'm discussing it, has to do with the particular forms of life lived by monks, nuns, hermits, friars, people who, and my work focuses on the Christian traditions, not because it's exclusive at all. There's also religious life in many other traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and there are even versions in the literature connected to Judaism and Islam. But Christianity is the thing I know. So in the Christian tradition, there have been since the 3rd century AD, people who made special commitments to poverty, chastity, and obedience, who lived in sometimes solitude, sometimes in community, but who had in common the renunciation of wealth, the renunciation of sex or marriage, and the renunciation of control over one's destiny. Okay, so what might be entailed in a vow of obedience, where you do as your director says. So I think that part of what motivates the book is that these ways of life, I think, are very alien to us, even those of us who are believers. It's unclear what's attractive about them. I myself spent some time in such a community, 3 years, so I have felt the attraction and lived in the attraction and lived in that kind of life and experienced quite a lot of what was wonderful about it and discerned out, and I miss it in many ways. So part of what the book is trying to do is to communicate something of what these ways of life mean and how they're not just a sort of niche historical happening, like something people did in the Middle Ages, but something which bears some fruit for anyone who's thinking about a meaningful life, a happy life, a flourishing life. So I think the particular characters I'm going to talk about might seem strange, but I hope you'll see that the questions that they are after are questions that any of us could ask, even if we came up with quite different kinds of solutions or different kinds of answers to those questions. Okay, so the specific question I want to talk about is the question of the transience of things. So this is something that one hears in spiritual life or in poetry or in wisdom traditions of various kinds, that life comes and it goes, it passes away, everything dies, everything is temporary. And this is, it's passed down through wisdom traditions in a variety of cases. And part of what I want to think about is supposing it's true, as I think we have to accept in some way it is, what is the appropriate response for us? What does it tell us about our lives that we see this? What are the array of possible responses, assuming that this is true, that everything passes away, everything dies, everything to which one might commit oneself, devote oneself, and pursue is temporary. Okay? So to try to feel the force of that and to think about what it might mean. And I'm going to begin with a couple of stories. It's my custom. I like to use stories. I always think better with examples. So one way that I'm Kant, for those of you, are there philosophy people here? Probably some, one or two. Okay. Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, says that examples are the go-karts of philosophy, by which he means they're like a cheap shortcut, like they take you down the mountain too fast. But I think they're good. So anyway, we're going to start with examples. So we're going to begin with an example, a woman named Mother Walada Petros. So she's an Ethiopian noblewoman of the 17th century. And she had 4 children in a row who died shortly after childbirth. After that, she has a hagiography, a biography of her life. She's considered a saint in the Ethiopian Coptic Church. After that, after these deaths of her children, she bore in mind the transience of the world. Her husband still loved her, but she no longer wanted to stay with him. She spent her nights in prayer and fasting and her nights in vigils. At holidays, she threw banquets to which all were invited, the poor and the wretched, along with the townspeople and the priests. When her husband left on a military campaign, she saw her chance. She gave away all her possessions, including all her jewelry, apparently 80 ounces weight of gold, and with 2 monks and 3 servants walked all through the night. They traveled several days to the monastic settlement at Zadeh, where Walada Petros shaved her head, took on a nun's cap, and swore to remain there for the rest of her life. So her husband learns of her departure. He's furious. This is a true story. There's a wonderful book that came out a few years ago, an English translation of her life, from which I gathered this incredible story. So there's no reason to think this isn't a historical figure and that this isn't in broad outline true. So her husband learns of her departure. He's completely furious, and he sends an army after her. He's a nobleman. He has an army of his own. They destroy a town, the town that's near Zadeh, and they set out to arrest her to return her to her husband. So she sees how much damage he's causing, so she goes back to him for a time. But her heart is still in the monastery. So at this time, and this is part of the fascinating piece of Ethiopian history, which I hadn't realized before reading this book. I've tried to learn more about it. So Ethiopia has one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, older than England or Germany. It's the earliest of the apostles settled in Ethiopia, and they built a Christian community that's very early. Nonetheless, they are proselytized by Portuguese missionaries, Roman Catholic missionaries. So they're Eastern Orthodox or Coptic Orthodox, and the Jesuit missionaries come from Portugal to try to convert them to the true Christianity. So you have Christians who are missionaries to other Christians, which to me is about the strangest thing you could imagine. Okay, that's a little historical side thing. So this is at the time when Walada Petros was living. So these Roman Catholic missionaries have arrived. The king has adopted the new faith, the Roman Catholic faith, and the Coptic Orthodox patriarch who Walada Petros follows is murdered. So Walada Petros' husband shows sympathy with these Roman Catholics. Walada Petros stops eating and drinking. She stops beautifying herself. She lives as a nun in her husband's household. And finally, she's kidnapped by the king and interrogated for a time. Finally, she's released to her monastic community, and she ends up gathering hundreds of followers. Okay, so this is a little snapshot of this person's life that begins from a call, what we call a call or a vocation to the religious life, and that call was rooted in a perception of the transience of things. And that perception of the transience of things is brought on by the deaths of her children. So when she perceives this transience, she's moved to sacrifice married life, wealth, privilege, power, everything that matters from a worldly point of view, and to give it all up to follow Christ. So I found a much later Orthodox nun, a 20th century figure, Mother Maria Spatsova. It's hard to pronounce. See, the party's out there, but the real party is in here. Okay, so Mother Maria describes, so she also loses a daughter and finds a vocation to the religious life afterwards.
Oh, it's a nice soundtrack.
You thought religious life was boring, but this is what it really is like. It's exciting. I don't know. It's going to be distracting, isn't it? Oh, no, they're traveling. Okay. It'll just be a minute. Okay. So while they're drumming, oh my gosh, there's people in regalia and drums. That's so cool. Okay. So Mother Maria has also lost a child. She's also a nun. She also finds her vocation to be a nun after this. After the death of her child. And this is how she writes about it. For some, it is not even a question of grief, but a sudden opening of gates into eternity, while the whole of natural existence has lost its stability and its coherence. Yesterday's laws have been abolished, desires have faded, meaninglessness has displaced meaning, and a different, albeit incomprehensible, meaning has caused wings to sprout at one's back. Into the grave's dark maw are plunged all hopes, plans, habits, calculations, and above all, meaning, the whole meaning of life. In the face of this, everything needs to be re-examined or rejected against falsehood or corruption. So for Mother Maria Skvortsova, grief reveals the truth about the world. It reveals the nature of things. And that nature of things that it brings light is just, I think, this thing that Willada Petros describes, the transience of things. The fact that the things that we care about, the things that we treasure, the things that we pursue, all of them pass away at one time or another. So, again, these women, each of them raised this question, and Mother Maria very directly, if this is true, what's the appropriate response? If the truth about life is transience, what's the appropriate response? So, in stories of vocation, so stories of people who leave everything for the religious life, which are, they sort of run all through Christian literature in every tradition. In vocation stories, success is as common as grief in inspiring this kind of disruptive discontent with ordinary life. So it's not just, say, the loss of a child, your hope for the future, but also sometimes the achievement or the holding in view of everything that one actually seems to want. So here, there's a beautiful example, also from, I guess, a little earlier, the 16th century, Teresa of Avila's account of the foundations of her monasteries. Teresa of Avila, the great nun and mystic, and author of numerous mystical treatises. She also wrote an account of the foundation of her monasteries. And she tells a story about another noblewoman with a religious vocation. So this woman, her name is Doña Casilda. She's beautiful. She's the heir to a large fortune. Her two older siblings have gone into religious life. They've become monks or nuns. So the rest of her family is quite anxious that she not do the same thing. So they betroth her to a man when she's 10 or 11 years old, very young even in those days. But something interesting happens, which is that she falls passionately and deeply in love with her fiancé. So Teresa writes the following about Doña Casilda's life. She had been spending a very happy day with her betrothed, whom she loved with an intensity rare for a child of her age, when suddenly she became very sad, for she realized that the day was over and that all other days would come to an end in the same way. So there's a long story of similar drama to Willada Petros of how this young woman ends up in a convent. In this case, she's warring with her parents, not with her husband. But she tries to join 3 times. The second time, she's being kept more or less as a prisoner of her family. And she runs a gambit where she sends her mother. Her mother goes to buy a mass. They're at a church. The mother goes off to buy a mass for someone, and the nanny is distracted by something. It goes to confession, I think, So then Doña Clotilda just puts her shoes up and runs for the convent, and runs and runs and runs and gets there before anyone else does, and gets the habit and just manages to become a nun. So these are women who have an incredibly intense desire to live this monastic life, a life where none of their advantages are put to use. So they leave wealth, family, power, position, in this woman's case, love, for this way of life. And these stories, they're highly dramatic. I'm giving you only two. There are many, many more. And the attachment to a vocation, to a call to the religious life, is strong enough to break every human bond. So the bond between you and your fiancé, the bond between you and your husband, in the case of Vlada Petros, the bond between you and your parents. There's a wonderful story. Thomas Aquinas, who has a special relationship with the Thomistic Institute, comes from one of the wealthiest families in Europe. He's meant to become a Benedictine monk. And he studies with this new community that's radical and weird. They're like the Occupy Wall Street, or the Democratic Socialists of the monastic world. That's terrible. I shouldn't be trying to make myself relevant. But anyway, they're very radical, weird people. And Thomas is just enchanted with them. And he decides to join them. He's on his way to Paris to their seminary. And his family kidnap him and lock him up in the house for a year, trying to keep him from joining this community. And finally he either escapes or they finally give up or whatever happens, but he finally makes it. So it's, again, just one more story of someone who has everything from our point of view, from the worldly point of view, from the point of view of their society, but they throw it all away for this other thing, this thing that we're calling the religious life. So in this particular talk, I'm thinking about what they're leaving behind, like what's motivating this more than what exactly they're getting. I'm going to leave that as an open question for the end of the talk. And I think that's a little awkward because they're obviously, I think, if you ask yourself the question, the central question, which is what's motivating these people? What would drive a person to give up everything that they had to live in complete separation, renouncing wealth and all these other things, every other earthly good? What motivates them? Well, they're acting like people in love, right? That's one of the reasons that the stories are so great. They sound like romantic stories. We've all been familiar from literature with stories about people who leave everything for, their beloved. But in this case, the beloved is not apparently a human being, but something eternal and transcendent. So it's this desire for the eternal and the transcendent, which is this passionate love even for the eternal and transcendent, which strikes me as mysterious, but it's also at the core, I think, of these particular stories. So you have on the one hand a perception of transience, perception of futility in ordinary life, and on the other, intense, passionate desire for the eternal, the transcendent. And that's a diminishment in some ways of the objects of desire for a Christian life, but it's still, there's something significant about that I want to try to focus in on. So what is this insight, that if we take Doña Casilda, the young Spanish nun, that provokes her to give up her beloved? She realizes after a wonderful day, one of these spectacular days that you never want to end, that it's going to end just like all the other days. So she sees a life dedicated to romantic love, marriage, and children as in some way futile. That is, it comes to an end. And this, again, is surprising to us because I think we prize romantic love quite highly in our culture. Romantic love is something that teenagers long for, the elderly long for. In the middle, there's this kind of constant tumult around it. There's another beautiful film, for those of you who like film or stories like this, It's a Polish film called Ida. It's from maybe 2013. I see someone nodding. And Ida is a young woman who is... There's a huge background. I've already spent too much time on the stories, so I have to give you some philosophical payoff soon, but the stories are so good. So I'll leave out a lot of the details, but she's caught between a call to a convent and a desire to go back into the world. In the middle of it, she has an affair with a young jazz musician. So she falls in love with a young jazz musician. They spend the night together. They wake up, and she's like, "So what happens now?" He's like, "Well, we go get breakfast and maybe hang out with the band again." She's like, "Yeah, and after that, what do we do?" Well, after that we, maybe we get married or have a couple of kids or get a dog, And after that, so she keeps asking this question: after that, after that, after that, after that. And it's not a question really about what her schedule is going to be. It's a question about what the point of that kind of existence is. That is, there's a sense in which, because all of these things somehow come to an end, that there's a futility in the whole endeavor. And I find this, honestly, philosophically, a little counterintuitive. So part of what you're hearing in this talk, or if you read the chapter about this, is me struggling to understand this particular point of view and trying to think my way into it. So you can tell me in the question period how well I succeeded or not. Okay. So we have in Willada Petros the transience of things. Doña Casilda, this day will end like all the others. Or in Ida, after that. After that? What happens after that? These are inquiries into the meaning of life and encounters with the transience of things. So it seems to them that even the most wonderful experiences happen in a sequence, one after another, each coming to an end. And so they can't qualify as goods that make a life worth living. Now, here's the question. It was why? Why would the recognition of transience of things make life not worth living? One common response that one hears, right? So and it's also mysterious because death is a fact that we're all aware of, and yet we continue, despite death, despite the destruction of empires, the destruction of whole civilizations, the destruction of lives, all kinds of destruction that we know from history and from our own experience. Human activity just continues on. We continue doing it. We're not deterred. So there's a set of counter evidence to this intuitive thought that everything is transient and so there's no point to anything. We maybe should despair, but we don't. And we just keep doing things. So that creates another mystery. If this is a truth about the way things are, why don't our lives reflect that? Why do we keep on doing things? So one sort of cliche, that it's a cliche, but it's one of these splendid cliches that can be formulated and reformulated by quite sophisticated thinkers as a response to exactly this kind of problem. And that response is that we should live in the moment. Okay? So philosopher Kiran Setia up at MIT has a wonderful piece on the midlife crisis, and that also became a book. That's what he argues in the end the response to these kind of sense of utility is to live in the moment, to treasure each experience. And I think there must be some truth in that. It's too common, it's too luminous a cliche for it not to be true. But it seems to me it faces two difficulties. One is it clashes with the experiences of our protagonists, the women that we were telling stories about. So Doña Casilda, for instance, she has a wonderful experience. She savors every second of it. But the fact that it ends still matters to her. So there's a bit of a tension in that. It doesn't seem like it's consoling to her to think, oh, well, there'll be many moments like this. We'll just keep enjoying them one after another. Just keep drinking them up. But the other problem that I think is in a way more serious is that it seems to be a counsel for the successful, for the people who are wealthy in the goods of life. So living in the moment doesn't seem appropriate if your life is disfigured by suffering, if your life is a constant struggle or encounter with pain. There's something that seems a bit patronizing about it if you imagine lives which are seriously challenged as far as the human goods are concerned. It doesn't seem like the right kind of advice to say live in the moment, even though there might, again, even in that case, be truth. So one of the things I think that's distinctive about Christianity, and I think you find it also versions of it also in other religions, is that there's something about suffering itself which offers a good which can be appreciated and grasped in the moment. But if you don't have some way of making sense of that, it seems to me the challenge is serious. Okay, so we've raised a problem. Things are transient, things die, all of our projects come to an end. All of our experiences exist one after the other. They each end. Our loved ones die. Our projects are finite. We've looked at one possible response. Okay, we should live in the moment. We've raised some difficulties about it, not conclusive, I don't think, but questions about whether that's right. It's worthwhile just trying to dig in a little bit deeper to how to respond. So one, we could ask ourselves the question of why exactly does the transience of things make life meaningless? What is it about it that makes it meaningless, or that threatens meaninglessness? So the philosopher Thomas Nagel has a very famous essay called The Absurd, where he argues that it's not the case. That is, that if something matters, it doesn't matter more for lasting longer. And that the reason why we end up with these puzzles about the meaning of life is that we can always ask more questions. You can always ask questions of justification. So you can always ask why. Why do that? And then, why am I giving this lecture? Well, to help people learn. And why am I trying to help people learn? Well, because, I don't know. I'm trying to think of, because they'll become better human beings. Well, what makes a human being better? Well, having a certain kind of wisdom or broad perspective on life. Well, why should you have a kind of wisdom or broad perspective on life? You can run these questions all the way back in just the same way that you can run the question that Ida asks, what happens after that, all the way back. And there's something for Nagel about our ability to formulate questions which generates an illusion of meaninglessness, but doesn't actually make anything meaningless. Because each of those things which we valued, the children of Wolada Petros, the day with the beloved that Doña Casilda experiences, they are genuinely really good. They don't become not good because they pass away. So it's a very powerful, very famous argument. And I think the problem with it, I want to say, is something like this. When we love something, it seems to me, we want it to last. It seems to be intrinsic to the meaning of love. So, and that's true for a person. It's true for a project. It's true for an activity. Whatever it is that we're holding as a core value for our lives, as constituting what matters most about it, as the end for which we're acting or around which everything is organized, whatever that thing is, if it's something that we love, we want it to last. And our desire is for its eternity in some way. And the source of the grief of life and the disappointment of life and the sense of transience is just the fact that that's not actually true. So I want to suggest as an alternative to someone like Nagel that the fundamental difficulty about the meaning of life is that we may want something most profoundly, the thing we may want as whatever it counts as meaning, happiness, flourishing, eudaimonia, that thing that we want more than anything, that thing is something which we desire to last. How long? Eternally. We never want it to die. It's never enough time. And so my thought is that this is the fault of Nagel's view, and this is also the challenge that transience presents to the meaningfulness of life. That is, we desire more than our sense of what a meaning is, our sense of what happiness is something that will last. That's the way our desires work. When it fails, we're miserable, or we grieve. And what happens, why is it that we keep busily pursuing our projects anyway? Because we hide from this fact. Okay? We keep replacing objects one after the other, right? Instead of, we're failing to, how do I put this? If I change my view about what happiness is once every 5 years or once every 10 years, I'll never notice that I didn't actually get the thing forever that I wanted to make me happy. So I think that's something like what happens to us. That's why we have this endless pursuit of endeavors that go one after the other, despite the fact that what we really want is something that will last forever, and despite the fact that none of our projects and none of our goals can suit it. Okay, so I raised a question with some stories about the transience of life and the thought that one might be passionately in love with what's transcendent and eternal. That was my interpretation of these characters. I then looked at the question of why it is that we think that the transience of life makes life meaningless. We talked about Nagel's point of view, which is that in fact it doesn't, because there are very meaningful, important, valuable things which last but a short time. And then my response to that, which is to say that nonetheless, we want those things to last forever. It's not that somehow they lose all their value if they don't, but they lose their value as sources of meaning for a whole life. They lose their value as organizing principles for happiness if they are transient and if they pass away. So that's the overall account of what my view is about this. And there's quite a lot of other examples and nuances and so on. But let me just end by looking at going back to our original stories. So we began by asking what it was that drove Violeta Petros, Doña Casilda, Maria Sheltsova, etc., to leave everything for the sake of and renounce power, privilege, etc. What is the thing that they're trying to organize their life around? And I suggested that it was the eternal and the transcendent in some sense. But I think that's still a bit mysterious. That is, it's not obvious without some more filling out of what this way of life is, or what the eternal and transcendent is. It's not obvious what really motivates a person like this. So in a way, I've made them too abstract, and I've left out the core, some sense of the core of what they're really interested in. So I don't want to keep talking forever and rambling on. So I think I've presented some arguments and a certain set of sequence. So why don't I stop there and take questions from you guys, and hopefully clarify.
Thanks for listening to this lecture on the Thomistic Institute podcast. The generosity of people like you makes this podcast possible. If you enjoy these talks, please consider showing your support at www.thomisticinstitute.org/donate. Your donation of even $1 helps us reach more college students and many others with the powerful truths of the faith, and it ensures that we can keep publishing top-notch lectures on this podcast. Thanks a lot.